was married to Mr. Josiah Bartlett, and was well off. Here I settled down, for all that I knew to the contrary, for life. For some years past, I had devoted my leisure hours from the forge to the honest endeavor to make up for the deficiencies in my youthful education, and had acquired, among other things, a good knowledge of medicine. I did not, however, believe in any of the schools, particularly those schools that make use of mineral medicines in their practice. I favored purely vegetable remedies, and had been very successful in administering them. So I began life anew, in Worthington, as a doctor, and aided by my half-sister and her friends, I soon secured a remunerative practice. I was beginning to be truly happy. I supposed that the final separation, mutually agreed upon between my wife and myself, was as effectual as all the courts in the country could make it, and I looked upon myself as a free man. Accordingly, after I had been in Worthington some months, I began to pay attentions to the daughter of a flourishing farmer. She was a fine girl, she received my addresses favorably, and we were finally privately married. This was the beginning of my lifelong troubles. In a few weeks her father found out that I had been previously married, and was not, so far as he knew, either a divorced man or a widower. And so it happened, that one day when I was at his house, and with his daughter, he suddenly came home with a posse of people and a warrant for my arrest. I was taken before a justice, and while we were waiting for proceedings to begin, or, possibly for the justice to arrive, I took the excited father aside and said, "You know I have a fine horse and buggy at the door. Get in with me, and ride down home. I will see your daughter and make everything right with her, and if you will let me run away, I'll give her the horse and buggy." The offer was too tempting to be refused. The father had the warrant in his pocket, and he accepted my proposal. We rode to his house, and he went into the back room by direction of his daughter while she and I talked in the hall. I explained matters as well as I could. I promised to see her again, and that very soon. My horse and buggy were at the door. Hastily bidding my new and young wife goodbye, I sprang into the buggy and drove rapidly away. The father rushed to the door and raised a great hue and cry, and what was more, raised the neighbors. I had not driven 5 miles before all Worthington was after me. But I had the start, the best horse, and I led in the race. I drove to Hancock, NY, where my pursuers lost the trail, thence to Bennington, VT, next to Brattleboro, VT, and from there to Templeton, Mass. What befell me at Templeton shall be related in the next chapter. Chapter 2. Miseries from my second marriage. Love-making in Massachusetts. Arrest for bigamy. Trial at Northampton. A stunning sentence. Sent to state prison. Learning the brush business. Sharpening picks. Prison fare in the hospital. Kind treatment. Successful horseshoeing the warden. My friend. Efforts for my release. A full pardon. At Templeton I speedily made known my profession, and soon had a very good medical practice, which 1 or 2 remarkable cures materially increased. I was doing well and making money. I boarded in a respectable farmer's family, and after living there about 6 months there came another most unhappy occurrence. From the day, almost, when I began to board with this farmer there sprung up a strong attachment between myself and his youngest daughter, which soon ripened into mutual love. She rode about with me when I went to see my patients, who were getting to be numerous, and we were much in each other's company. On one occasion she accompanied me to Worcester, where I had some patients. We went to a public house where she and her family were well known, and when she was asked by the landlord how she happened to come there with the doctor, her prompt answer was, "Why, we are married, didn't you know it?" She refused even to go to the table without my attendance, and when I was out visiting some patients, she waited for her meals till I came back. We stayed there but 2 days and returned together to Templeton. A month afterward her brother was in Worcester, and stopped at this house. The landlord, after some conversation about general matters, said, "So your sister is married to the doctor?" "I know nothing about it," was the reply. This led to a full and altogether too free disclosure to the astonished brother about the particulars of our visit to the same house a month before, and his sister's representations that we were married. The brother immediately started for home, and repeated the story, as it was told to him, to his father and the family. Without seeing his daughter, the father at once procured a warrant, and had me arrested and brought before a justice on charge of seduction. The trial was brief. The daughter herself swore positively, that though she had been imprudent and indiscreet in going to Worcester with me, no improper communication had ever, there, or elsewhere, taken place between us. Of course, there was nothing to do but to let me go, and I was discharged. But out of this affair came the worst that had yet fallen to my lot in life. The story got into the papers, with particulars and names of the parties, and in this way the people at Worthington, who had chased me as far as Hancock and had there lost all trace of me, found out where I was. If I had been aware of it, they might have looked elsewhere for me, but while I was felicitating myself upon my escape from the latest difficulty, down came an officer from Worthington with a warrant for my arrest. This officer, the sheriff, was connected with the family into which I had married in Worthington, and with him came 2 or 3 more relatives, all bound, as they boasted, to put me through. They were excessively irate against me and very much angered, especially that their race after me to Hancock had been fruitless. I had fallen into the worst possible hands. They took me to Northampton and brought me before a justice, on a charge of bigamy. The sheriff who arrested me, and the relatives who accompanied him were willing to swear my life away, if they could, and the justice was ready enough to bind me over to take my trial in court, which was not to be in session for full 6 months to come. Those long, weary 6 months I passed in the county jail. Then came my trial. I had good counsel. There was not a particle of proof that I was guilty of bigamy. No attempt was made on the part of the prosecution to produce my first wife, from whom I had separated, or, indeed, to show that there was such a woman in existence. But, evidence or no evidence, with all Worthington against me, conviction was inevitable. The jury found me guilty. The judge promptly sentenced me to 3 years' imprisonment in the state prison, at Charlestown, with hard labor, the first day to be passed in solitary confinement. This severe sentence fairly stunned me. I was taken back to jail, and the following day I was conveyed to Charlestown with heavy irons on my ankles and handcuffed. No murderer would have been more heavily ironed. We started early in the morning, and by noon I was duly delivered to the warden at Charlestown prison. I was taken into the office, measured, asked my name, age, and other particulars, and then if I had a trade. To this I at once answered, no. I wanted my 24 hours solitary confinement in which to reflect upon the kind of hard labor, prescribed in my sentence, I was willing to follow for the next 3 years, and I also wanted information about the branches of labor pursued in that prison. The next words of the warden assured me that he was a kind and compassionate man. Go, he said to an officer, and instantly take off those irons when you take him inside the prison. I was taken in and the irons were taken off. I was then undressed, my clothes were removed to another room, and I was redressed in the prison uniform. This was a grotesque uniform indeed. The suit was red and blue, half and half, like a harlequin's, and to crown all came a hat or cap, like a fool's cap, a foot and a half high and running up to a peak. Miserable as I was, I could scarcely help smiling at the utterly absurd appearance I knew I then presented. I even ventured to remark upon it, but was suddenly and sternly checked with the command, silence. There's no talking aloud here. Then began my 24 hours solitary confinement, and 24 wretched hours they were. I had only bread and water to eat and drink, and I need not say that my unhappy thoughts would not permit me to sleep. At noon next day I was taken from my cell, and brought again before the warden, Mr. Robinson, who kindly said, "You have no trade, you say, what do you want to go to work at?" "Anything light, I am not used to hard labor," I replied. So the warden directed that I should be put at work in the brush shop, where all kinds of brushes were made. Mr. Eddy was the officer in charge of this shop, and Mr. Knowles, the contractor for the labor employed in the brush business, was present. Both of these gentlemen took pains to instruct me in the work I was to begin upon, and were very kind in their manner towards me. I went to work in a bungling way and with a sad and heavy heart. At 12 o'clock we were marched from the shop to our cells, each man taking from a trap in the wall, as he went by, his pen containing his dinner, which consisted, that day, of boiled beef and potatoes. It was probably the worst dinner I had ever eaten, but I had yet to learn what prison fare was. From 1 o'clock to 6 I was in the shop again, then came supper mush and molasses that evening, which was varied, as I learned afterwards, on different days by rye bread, or Indian bread and rye coffee. These things were also served for breakfast, and the dinners were varied on different days in the week. The fare was very coarse, always, but abundant and wholesome. After supper prisoners were expected to go to bed, as they were called out at 6 o'clock in the morning. I stayed in the brush shop 3 or 4 months, but I made very little progress in learning the trade. I was willing enough to learn and did my best. From the day I entered the prison I made up my mind to behave as well as I could, to be docile and obedient, and to comply with every rule and order. Consequently I had no trouble, and the officers all treated me kindly. Warden Robinson was a model man for his position. He believed that prisoners could be reformed more easily by mild than by harsh measures. At least they would be more contented with their lot and would be subordinate. Every now and then he would ask prisoners if they were well treated by the officers, how they were getting on, if they had enough to eat, and so on. The officers seemed imbued with the warden's spirit. The chaplain of the prison, who conducted the Sunday services and also held a Sunday school, was one of the finest men in the world, and took a personal interest in every prisoner. Altogether, it was a model institution. But in spite of good treatment I was intensely miserable, my mind was morbid, I was nearly, if not quite, insane, and one day during the dinner hour, I opened a vein in each arm in hopes that I should bleed to death. Bleed I did, till I fainted away, and as I did not come out when the other prisoners did, the officer came to my cell and discovered my condition. He at once sent for the doctor, who came and stopped the hemorrhage, and then sent me to the hospital, where I remained 2 weeks. After I came out of the hospitals the warden talked to me about my situation and feelings. He advised me to go into the blacksmith shop, of course not dreaming that I knew anything of the work, but he said I would have more liberty there, that the men moved about freely and could talk to each other, that the work mainly was sharpening picks and tools, and that I could at least blow and strike. So I went into the blacksmith shop, and remained there 6 weeks. But, debilitated as I was, the work was too hard for me, and so the warden put me in the yard to do what I could. I also swept the halls and assisted in the cookroom. One day when the warden spoke to me, I told him that I knew something about taking care of the sick, and after some conversation, he transferred me to the hospital as a nurse. Here, if there is such a thing as contentment in prison, I was comparatively happy. I nursed the sick and administered medicines under direction of the doctor. I had too, with all easy position, more liberty than any other prisoner. I could go anywhere about the halls and yard, and in a few weeks I was frequently sent on an errand into the town. Everyone seemed to have the fullest confidence in me. The warden talked to me whenever he saw me, and always had some kind word for me. One day I ventured to speak to him about his horse, of which he was very proud, and indeed the horse was a very fine one. "Mr. Warden," said I, "that's a noble horse of yours, but he interferes badly, and that is only because he is badly shod. If you will trust me, I can shoe him so as to prevent all that." "Can you?" exclaimed the warden in great surprise. "Well, if you can, I'll give you a good piece of bread and butter, or anything else you want." "I don't want your bread and butter," said I, "but I will shoe your horse as he has never been shod before." "Well, take the horse to the shop and see what you can do." Of course, I knew that by bread and butter the warden meant that if I could shoe his favorite horse so as to prevent him from interfering, he would gladly favor me as far as he could, and I knew, too, that I could make as good a shoe as any horse need wear. I gladly led the horse to the shop where I had so signally failed in pick and tool sharpening, and was received with jeers by my old comrades who wanted to know what I was going to do to that horse. "Oh, simply shoe him," I said. This greatly increased the mirth of my former shopmates, but their amusement speedily changed to amazement as they saw me make my nails, turn the shoes and neatly put them on. In due time the horse was shod, and I led him to the warden for inspection, and before him and an officer who stood by him, I led the horse up and down to show that he did not interfere. The warden's delight was unbounded. He never saw such a set of shoes. He declared that they fitted as if they had grown to the horse's hoofs. I need not say that from that day till the day I left the prison, I had everything I wanted from the warden's own table. I fared as well as he did, and had favors innumerable. About once a month I shod that horse, little thinking that he was to carry me over my 3 years' imprisonment in just half that time. Yet so it was. For talking now almost daily, in the hospital or in the yard, with the warden, he became interested in me, and in answer to his inquiries I told him the whole story of my persecution, as I considered it, my trial and my unjust and severe sentence. When he had heard all he said, "You ought not to be here another day, you ought to go out." The good chaplain also interested himself in my case, and after hearing the story, he and the warden took a lawyer named Bemis into their council, laid the whole matter before him and asked his opinion. Mr. Bemis, after hearing all the circumstances, expressed the belief that I might get a pardon. He entered into the matter with his whole heart. He sent for my son Henry and my first wife, and they came and corroborated my statement about the mutual agreement for separation, and told how long we had been parted. Mr. Bemis and they then went to Governor Briggs, and told him the story, and that I had served out half of my severe sentence, and pressed for a pardon. The governor after due deliberation consented to their request. They came back to Charlestown with the joyful intelligence. Warden Robinson advised my son, that considering my present mental and physical condition, he had better break the intelligence gradually to me, and so Henry came to me and said, simply, that he thought he would soon have good news for me. The next day I was told that my pardon was certain. The day following, at 12 o'clock, I walked out, after 18 months' imprisonment, a free man. I was in the streets of Charlestown with my own clothes on and $5, given to me by the warden, in my pocket. I was poor, truly, but I was at liberty, and that for the day was enough. Chapter 3. The Schuymer Sensation. The Schuymer family in love with Sarah attempt to elope. How it was prevented. The second attempt, a midnight expedition. The alarm, a frightful beating. Escape. Flogging the devil out of Sarah. Winter in New Hampshire. Return to New Jersey. Boston. Yankee. Plans to secure Sarah. I went at once to the prisoner's home, where I was kindly received, and I stayed there 2 days. The superintendent then paid my passage to Pittsfield, where I wished to go and meet my son. From Pittsfield I went to Albany, then New York, and from there to Newtown, NJ. Here I went into practice, meeting with almost immediate success, and stayed there 2 months. It was my habit to go from town to attend to cases of a certain class and to sell my vegetable preparations, and from Newtown I went to Belvidere, stopping at intermediate towns on the way, and from Belvidere I went to Harmony, a short distance below, to attend a case of white swelling, which I cured. Now just across the Delaware River, 9 miles above Easton, Penn, lived a wealthy Dutch farmer, named Schuymer, who heard of the cure I had effected in Harmony, and as he had a son, 16 years of age, afflicted in the same way, he sent for me to come and see him. I crossed the river, saw the boy, and at Schuymer's request took up my residence with him to attend to the case. He was to give me, with my board, $500 if I cured the boy, but though the boy recovered under my treatment, I never received my fee for reasons which will appear anon. I secured some other practice in the neighborhood, and frequently visited Easton, Belvidere, Harmony, Oxford, and other nearby places, on either side of the river. The Schuymer family consisted of the old folks and 4 sons and 4 daughters, the children grown up, for my patient, 16 years old, was the youngest. The youngest daughter, Sarah, 18 years old, was an accomplished and beautiful girl. Now it would seem as if with my sad experience I ought by this time, to have turned my back on women forever. But I think I was a monomaniac on the subject of matrimony. My first wife had so misused me that it was always in my mind that some reparation was due me, and that I was fairly entitled to a good helpmate. The ill success of my efforts, hitherto, to secure one, and my consequent sufferings were all lost upon me. Bitter experience, had taught me nothing. I had not been in the Schuymer family 3 months before I fell in love with the daughter Sarah, and she returned my passion. She promised to marry me, but said there was no use in saying anything to her parents about it, they would never consent on account of the disparity in our ages, for I was then 40 years old, but she would marry me nevertheless, if we had to run away together. Meanwhile, the old folks had seen enough of our intimacy to suspect that it might lead to something yet closer, and one day Mr. Schuymer invited me to leave his house and not to return. I asked for one last interview with Sarah, which was accorded, and we then arranged a plan by which she should meet me the next afternoon at 4 o'clock at the Jersey Ferry, a mile below the house, when we proposed to quietly cross over to Belvedere and get married. I then took leave of her and the family and went away. The next day, at the appointed time, I was at the ferry. Sarah, as I learned afterwards, left the house at a much earlier hour to take a walk, and while she was, foolishly I think, making a circuitous route to reach the ferry, her father, who suspected that she intended to run away, went to the ferryman and told him his suspicions, directing him if Sarah came there by no means to permit her to cross the river. Consequently, when Sarah met me at the ferryman flatly refused to let either of us go over. He knew all about it, he said, and it was no go. I had $200 in my pocket and I offered him any reasonable sum, if he would only let us cross, but no, he knew the shamers better than he knew me, and their goodwill was worth more than mine. Here was a block to the game, indeed. I had sent my baggage forward in the morning to Belvedere. Sarah had nothing but the clothes she wore, for she was so carefully watched that she could carry or send nothing away, but she was ready to go if the obstinate ferryman had not prevented us. While we were pressing the ferryman to favor us, down came one of Sarah's brothers with a dozen neighbors, and told her she must return home or he would carry her back by force. I interfered and said she should not go. Whereupon one fellow took hold of me and I promptly knocked him down, and notified the crowd that the first who laid hands on me, or who attempted to take her home violently, would get a dose from my pistol, which I then exhibited. Sarah must go willingly or not at all, said I. The production of my pistol, the only weapon in the crowd, brought about a new state of affairs, and the brother and others tried persuasion, but Sarah stoutly insisted that she would not return. Now hold on, boys, said I am going to say something to her. I then took her aside and told her that there was no use in trying to run away then, that she had better go home quietly, and tell the folks that she was sorry for what she had done, that she had broken off with me, and would have nothing more to do with me, that I would surely see her tomorrow, and then we could make a new plan. So she announced her willingness to go quietly home with her brother, and she did so. I went to a public house half a mile below the ferry. That night the gang came down to this house with the intention of driving me away from the place, or, possibly, of doing something worse, but while they were howling outside, the landlord sent me to my room and then went out and told the crowd I had gone away. The next morning I boldly walked up to Schuymer's house to get a few books and other things I had left there, and I saw Sarah. I told her to be ready on the following Thursday night and I would have a ladder against her window for her to escape by. She promised to be ready. Meantime, though I had been in the house but a few minutes, someone who had seen me go in gathered the crowd of the day before, and the first thing I knew the house was besieged. Mrs. Schuymer had gone upstairs for my things. I went out and faced the little mob. I was told to leave the place or they would kill me. One of Sarah's brothers ran into the house, brought out a musket and aimed it at me, but it missed fire. I drew my pistol, the crowd keeping well away then, and told him that if he did not instantly bring that musket to me I would shoot him. He brought it, and I threw it over the fence, Sarah crying out from the window, "Good! Good!" The mob then turned and abused and blackguarded her. Then the old lady came out, bringing a carpet bag containing my books and things, asking me to see if it was all right. I had no disposition to stop and examine just then. I told the mob I had no other business there, that I was going away, and to my surprise, I confess, I was permitted to leave the place unmolested. It is quite certain the ferryman made no objection to my crossing, and I went to Belvedere, where I remained quietly till the appointed Thursday night, when I started with a trusty man for Skymers. We timed our journey so as to arrive there at 1 o'clock in the morning. Ever since her attempt to elope, Sarah had been watched night and day, and to prevent her abduction by me, Mr. Skymer had 2 or 3 men in the house to stand guard at night. Sarah was locked in her room, which is precisely what we had provided for no one in the house supposed that she could escape by the window. There was a big dog on the premises, but he and I were old friends, and he seemed very glad to see me when I came on the ground on this eventful night. Sarah was watching, and when I made the signal she opened the window and threw out her ready-prepared bundle. Then my man and I set the ladder and she came safely to the ground. A moment more and we would have stolen away, when, as ill luck would have it, the ladder fell with a great crash, and the infernal dog, that a moment before seemed almost in our confidence, set up a howl and then barked loud enough to wake the dead. Forthwith issued from the house old Skymer, 2 of his sons and his hired guard, a half-dozen in all. There was a time then. The girl was instantly seized and taken into the house. Then all hands fell upon us too, and though I and my man fought our best they managed to pound us nearly to death. The dog, too, in revenge no doubt for the scare the latter had given him, or perhaps to show his loyalty to his master, assisted in rooting us, and put in a bite where he could. It is a wonder we were not killed. Sarah, meanwhile, was calling out from the house, and imploring them not to murder us. How we ever got away I hardly know now, but presently we found ourselves in the road running for our lives, and running also for the carriage we had concealed in the woods, half a mile above. We reached it, and hastily unhitching and getting in we drove rapidly for the bridge crossing over to Belvedere. That beautiful August night had very few charms for us. It would have been different indeed if I had succeeded in securing my Sarah, and to think of having the prize in my very grasp, and the losing all. We reached the hotel in Belvedere at about 2:30 o'clock in the morning, wearied, worn, bruised and disheartened. My man had not suffered nearly as severely as I had. The bulk of their blows fell upon me, and I had the sorest body and the worst-looking face I had ever exhibited. I rested one day and then hurried on to New York. Of course, I had no means of knowing the feelings or condition of the loved girl from whom I had been so suddenly and so violently parted. I only learned from an Easton man whom I knew and whom I met in the city, that Sarah Skymer was sick. That was all. The man said he didn't know the family very well, but he had heard that Miss Skymer had been out of her head, if not downright crazy. Crazy indeed. How mad and how miserable that poor girl was made by her own family, I did not know till months afterward, and then I had the terrible story from her own lips. It seems that when her father and his gang returned from pursuing me, as they did a little way up the road towards Belvedere, they found her almost frantic. They locked her up in her room that night with no one to say so much as a kind word to her. How she passed that night, after the scenes she had witnessed, and the abuse with which her father and brothers had loaded her before they thrust her into her prison, may be imagined. The next day she was wrought up to a frenzy. Her parents pronounced her insane, and called in a Dutch doctor who examined her and said she was bewitched. And this is the remedy he proposed as a cure. He advised that she should be soundly flogged, and the devil whipped out of her. Her family, intensely angered at her for the trouble she had made them, or rather had caused them to make for themselves, were only too glad to accept the advice. The old man and 2 sons carried a sore bruise or 2 apiece they got from me the night before, and seized the opportunity to pay them off upon her. So they stripped her bare, and flogged her till her back was a mass of welts and cuts, and then put her to bed. That bed she never left for 2 months, and then came out the shadow of her former self. But the Dutch doctor declared that the devil was whipped out of her, and that she was entirely cured. A few months afterward the family had the best of reasons for believing that they had whipped the devil into her, instead of out of her. After staying in New York a few days, I went to Dover, NH, where I had some acquaintances, and where I hoped to get into a medical practice, which, with the help of my friends, I did very soon. I lived quietly in that place all winter, earning a good living and laying by some money. During the whole time I never heard a word from Sarah. I wrote at least 50 letters to her, but as I learned afterward, and, indeed, surmised at the time, every one of them was intercepted by her father or brothers, and she did not know where I was and so could not write to me. I left Dover in May and went down to New York. I had some business there which was soon transacted, and early in June I went over to New Jersey to Oxford, a small place near Belvedere. This place I meant to make my base of operations for the new campaign I had been planning all winter. I put up at a public house kept by a man who was known in the region round about as the Boston Yankee, for he migrated from Boston to New Jersey and was doing a thriving business at hotel keeping in Oxford. What a thorough good fellow he was will presently appear. I had been in the hotel 4 days and had become pretty intimate with the landlord before I ventured to make inquiries about what I was most anxious to learn, but finally I asked him if he knew the Shamers over the river. He looked at me in a very comical way, and then broke out, "Well, I declare, I thought I knew you. You're the chap that tried to run away with old Schuymer's daughter Sarah last August, and you're down here to get her this time, if you can." I owned up to my identity, but warned Boston Yankee that if he told anyone who I was, or that I was about there, I'd blow his brains out. "You keep cool," said he, "don't you be uneasy, I'm your friend and the gal's friend, and I'll help you both all I can, and if you want to carry off Sarah Schuymer and marry her, I'll tell you how to work it. You see she has been watched as closely as possible all winter, ever since she got well, for she was crazy like, a while. Well, you could get nearer to her, first off, than you could to the North Pole, but do you remember Mary Smith who was servant gal, there when you boarded with Schuymer?" I remembered the girl well and told him so, and he continued, "Well, I saw her the other day, and she told me she was living in Easton, and where she could be found. Now, I'll give you full directions and do you take my horse and buggy tomorrow morning early and go down and see her, and get her to go over and let Sarah know that you're round. Meantime I'll keep dark, I know my business and you know yours." I need not say how overjoyed I was to find this new and most unexpected friend, and how gratefully I accepted his offer. He gave me the street, house, and number where Mary Smith lived, and during the evening we planned together exactly how the whole affair was to be managed, from beginning to end. I went to bed, but could scarcely sleep, and all night long I was agitated by alternate hopes and fears for the success of the scheme of tomorrow. Chapter 4. Success with Sarah. Mary Smith as a Confederate. The plot waiting in the woods. The spy outwitted Sarah secured the pursuer's baffled night on the road efforts to get married. The old offender married at last. A constable after Sarah he gives it up. An ale orgy returned to Boston Yankees a home in Goshen. It was Saturday morning, and after an early breakfast I was on the road with Boston Yankees fast horse, towards Easton. On my arrival there I had no difficulty in finding Mary Smith, who recognized me at once, and was very glad to see me. She knew I had come there to learn something about Sarah. She had seen her only a week ago, she was well again, and the girls had talked together about me. This was pleasant to hear, and I at once proposed to Mary to go to Schuymer's and tell Sarah that I was there. I would give her $10 if she would go. Oh! She would gladly serve us both for nothing. So she made herself ready, got into the buggy, and we started for Skymers. When we were well on the road I said to her, "Now, Mary, attend carefully to what I say. You will need to be very cautious in breaking the news to Sarah that I am here. She has already suffered a great deal on my account, and may be very timid about my being in the neighborhood, but if she still loves me as you say she does, she will run any risk to see me, and, if I know her, she will be glad to go away with me. Now, this is what you must do. You must see her alone and tell her my plan. Here, take this diamond ring, she knows it well. Manage to let her see it on your finger, then tell her that if she is willing to leave home and marry me, I will be in the woods half a mile above her house tomorrow afternoon at 5 o'clock, with a horse and buggy ready to carry her to Belvedere. If she will not, or dare not come, give her the ring, and tell her we part, good friends, forever." It was a beautiful afternoon as we drove along the road. We talked about Sarah and old times, and I made her repeat my instructions over and over again, and she promised to convey every word to Sarah. We neared Skymers' house about 6 o'clock, and when we were a little way from there I told Mary to get out, so as to excite no suspicions as to who I was. She did so, and I waited till I saw her go into the house, and then drove rapidly by towards the Belvedere Bridge, and was safely at Oxford by nightfall. I told my friend, the landlord, what I had done, and he said that everything was well planned. He also promised to go with me next day to assist me if necessary, and, said he, if everything is all right, do you carry off the girl and I'll walk up to Belvedere, but don't bring Sarah this way, head toward Water Gap. When you're married fast and sure, you can come back here as leisurely as you're a mind to, and nobody can lay a hand upon you or her. We arranged some other minor details of our expedition and I went to bed. The next afternoon at 4 o'clock I was at the appointed place, and Boston Yankee was with me. I did not look for Sarah before 5 o'clock, so we tied our horse and kept a good watch upon the road. An hour went by and no Sarah appeared. I told Boston Yankee I did not believe she would come. "Don't be impatient, wait a little longer," said my friend. In 20 minutes we saw emerge, not from Skymers' house, but from his eldest son's house, which was still nearer to the place where we were waiting, 3 women, 2 of whom I recognized as Sarah and Mary, and the third I did not know, nor could I imagine why she was with the other 2, but as I saw them, leaving Boston Yankee in the woods, I drove the horse down into the road. As Sarah drew near she kissed her hand to me and came up to the wagon. "Are you ready to go with me?" I asked. "I am, indeed," was her reply, and I put out my hand to help her into the buggy. But the third woman caught hold of her dress, tried to prevent her from getting in, and began to scream so as to attract attention at Sarah's brother's house. I told the woman to let her go, and threatened her with my whip. "Get away," shouted Boston Yankee, who had come upon the scene. "Drive as fast as you can, never mind if you kill the horse." We started, the woman still shouting for help, and I drove on as rapidly as the horse would go. When we had gone on a mile or 2, I asked Sarah what all this meant. She told me that the woman was her brother's servant, that Mary and herself left her father's house a little after 4 o'clock to go over and call at her brother's, that just before 5, when she was to meet me, she and Mary proposed to go out for a walk, that the whole family watched her constantly, and so her brother's wife told the servant woman to get on her things and go with them. "You may be sure," she added, "that the woman will arouse the whole neighborhood, and that they will all be after us." I needed no further hint to push on. We were going toward Water Gap, as Boston Yankee had advised, and when we were about 8 miles on the way, I deemed it prudent to drive into the woods and to wait till night before going on. We drove in just off the road, and tied our horse. We were effectually concealed. Our pursuers, if there were any, would be sure to go by us, and meantime we could talk over our plans for the future. Sarah told me that when Mary came to the house the night before, she was not at all surprised to see her, as she occasionally came up from Easton to make them a little visit, and to stay all night, that she went to the summer house with Mary to sit down and talk, and almost immediately saw the ring on Mary's finger, that when she saw it she at once recognized it, and asked her, "Oh, Mary, where did you get that ring?" "Keep quiet," said Mary, "don't talk loud, or someone may hear you, don't be agitated, your lover is near, and has sent me to tell you." It was joyful news to Sarah, and how readily she had acquiesced in my plan for an elopement was manifest in the fact that she was then by my side. We had not been in the woods an hour when, as I anticipated, we heard our pursuers, we did not know how many there were, drive rapidly by. "Now we can go on, I suppose," said Sarah. "Oh no, my dear," I replied, "now is just the time to wait quietly here," and wait we did till 8 o'clock, when our pursuers, having gone on a few miles, and having seen or learned nothing of the fugitives, came by again on the back track. They must have thought we had turned off into some other road. I waited a while longer to let our friends get a little nearer home and further away from us, and then took the road again toward Water Gap. We reached Water Gap at midnight, had some supper and fed the horse. We rested a while, and then drove leisurely on 9 miles further, where we waited till daylight and crossed the river. We were in no great hurry now, we were comparatively safe from pursuit. We soon came to a public house, where we stopped and put out the horse, intending to take breakfast. While I was inquiring of the landlord if there was a justice of the peace in the neighborhood, the landlord's wife had elicited from Sarah the fact of our elopement, who she was, who her folks were, and so on. The well-meaning landlady advised Sarah to go back home and get her parents' consent before she married. Sarah suggested that the very impossibility of getting such consent was the reason for her running away, nor did it appear how she was to go back home alone even if she desired to. We saw that we could get no help there, so I countermanded my order for breakfast, offering at the same time to pay for it as if we had eaten it, ordered out my horse and drove on. After riding some 10 miles we arrived at another public house on the road, and as the landlord come out to the door I immediately asked him where I could find a justice of the peace. He laughed, for he at once comprehended the whole situation, and said, "Well, well. I am an old offender myself, I ran away with my wife, there is a justice of the peace 2 miles from here, and if you'll come in I'll have him here within an hour." We had reached the right place at last, for while